This is Going Underground. I'm Afshin Rattansi. Coming up on the show, the European Coalition for Corporate Justice has reported that half of all companies on the FTSE 100 have been accused of human rights-related abuses over the last 10 years. Is that why the Tories want to abolish the Human Rights Act? And Ed Miliband reshuffled the lower echelons of his front bench this week, but will Labour always be pro-capitalist and pro-imperialist? Plus, corruption is reportedly seeping into every level of our police service. But just how many of our coppers are on the take? All this and more coming up on today's Going Underground. This week marks the third anniversary of Britain's war with Libya and the Western-backed assassination of its leader, Muammar Gaddafi. Before Cameron, Gaddafi and his regime had turned one of the poorest nations in Africa into the continent's richest state. Libya had the highest GDP per capita and life expectancy in all of Africa. Fewer people lived in poverty than in Holland. After David Cameron ordered British forces to bomb Libya, the country has become a failed state. Its economy is in shambles after the cessation of oil production. Rival militias fight for power, and this week a dispute between rival governments is threatening to cause even more chaos after NATO's destruction of the country. The British-backed government in Tobruk is now desperately trying to regain the old capital of Tripoli from Wahhabi militants who fight under the ISIS-affiliated banner of Libyan Dawn. Interestingly, though Britain supports the Libyan Prime Minister Abdullah Al-Thani, there's been nothing forthcoming from David Cameron or Ed Miliband about Al-Thani's accusation that UK ally Qatar is supporting Libyan Dawn. So, yet again, the Foreign Office and Number 10 have questions to answer. Why are we bombing ISIS in Iraq when we helped create ISIS in Libya? And why are we friends with those countries allied to ISIS in Libya as wars catalyzed by the UK rage from the Eastern Mediterranean to the Atlantic Ocean? Home Secretary Theresa May garnered headlines at the Tory conference for wanting Britain to break away from the European Convention on Human Rights. With me is the leading human rights QC, Richard Clayton, of 4 to 5 Gray's Inn Square. Welcome, Richard, to Going Underground. What's the opinion of QCs about the anti-democratic nature of Strasbourg's influence on our courts?
Well, I'm not sure it is anti-democratic. I mean, the essence of the Strasbourg system is that we signed up to an international convention and we agreed to it.
And the roots of that, of course, with Churchill, which is why we have him there. I mean, the origins of it were Churchill's fear of socialism, a safeguard against socialism.
Well, not so much socialism, I think. It was much more a reflection of a repudiation of what people saw as totalitarianism. But it's important to remember that the Nazis and the Italians fascists ran legal systems which on their face complied with legal formalities, but ended up in the wrong place. So people thought you had to introduce some sort of something into the law that made sure the outcomes were better.
Too much, then, to accuse Theresa May and Chris Grayling of rolling back those reforms? But, I mean, even Lord Neuberger from the Supreme Court arguing against elements of the Strasbourg legislation and the convention, saying it's too easy. Too many lawyers in Britain are taking Strasbourg's opinions over those of courts here in Britain.
Well, I don't think that's quite right. I don't think that's actually what Lord Neuberger was saying. The debate, which I think you're referring to, is the question of whether and to what extent Strasbourg decisions should decide the result in cases under the Human Rights Act. And in reality, the position's been changing over the last 5 years, and particularly and most strikingly in a case I was in the Supreme Court earlier this year, the Supreme Court decided not to follow 7 Strasbourg decisions in concluding that freedom of expression did not create a right of access to information. So it's not the case that we or the English courts simply apply what Strasbourg says. And I think the biggest development in the Supreme Court since Lord Bingham's retirement in 2009 has been that the English courts feel freer to depart from Strasbourg case law.
So then what's the point? Why did Theresa May bother? If there she was saying, it's all Strasbourg's fault, too often it's decisions from there, and you're giving me cases where this is obviously patently not true.
Well, I think there are 2 answers. One of them is that from a technical legal perspective, the proposals don't stack up. And therefore, I think the answers that you need to search for are not on the legal, but on the political level.
It's not just them being mean, is it? Because even in the May speech, immediately she was targeting, she said the problem with the European Court was that it protected prisoners too much and protected those accusing British troops of torture.
Well, at the end of the day, the purpose of any human rights instrument is to protect those who are vulnerable. And I mean, that's the whole purpose of it. So it really doesn't take it very far to make that point. And it has to be said, and something which I think is seldom acknowledged, is the cases that the UK has lost in Strasbourg are very few and far between. Overwhelmingly, the government wins the cases, and the cases that it loses, you might think, are cases where something has gone badly wrong.
So it actually does look like being vindictive on the part of the government.
Far be it from me as a lawyer to say, but you may think there are other political factors in play, like the growth of UKIP, the government's reaction to that, the government's view on Europe more generally. And I mean, I think one of the saddest consequences of political developments is how somehow the European Convention on Human Rights has become the whipping boy or the lightning rod through which a lot of anti-European debates are being fought.
Did you find any irony then that the debate was framed in that way, all about Europe, and yet Parliament, our Parliament, is pretty discredited, and yet the alternative seemed to be that Parliament should be the supreme authority over legal jurisdiction?
Right. It is the case that Parliament rules supreme in domestic law, but that isn't the basis upon which Convention law takes effect in English law.
She said ultimate source of legal authority.
But that's, I mean, that is...
Is that not true?
Well, that is not true so far as it goes. It is true that so far as legislation in the UK is concerned, Parliament is supreme. But in relation to international treaties, Parliament has nothing to do with international treaties unless they become part of domestic law, like the Human Rights Act made the European Convention part of domestic law. But it seems to me to be a bit of a legal muddle.
Well, talking about international relations, yet again, she mentioned another person who is no doubt vulnerable. She made the allegation that the Strasbourg rulings were stopping people from courts from deporting people to Somalian war zones, in effect, because there's a phrase, degrading treatment?
Inhuman treatment. Well, that again is a very well-worn battleground where the UK government has consistently lost. The fact of the matter is that if you seek to deport someone to a place where they'll be subject to inhuman treatment or torture, then if there's a substantial risk of that occurring, they won't be deported there. Now, some people might think that it's difficult to justify sending someone away to a place where they would be subject to breaches of human rights of a very serious nature as well. I mean, inhuman treatment is not something that be lightly put to one side.
And Western foreign policy has a legacy in Somalia. So is she saying, therefore, that it is only the European Convention that is stopping us deporting people to places where they would be degraded, their human rights degraded?
Yeah, it may well be that is, but that may well be so. But at the end of the day, the point of all human rights laws is to introduce into a legal system some sense of core values. And it's really a question of whether you accept the core values, whether you regard them as the hallmark of a civilized society. But many might think that not sending people away to be tortured is a position which has a lot in its favour.
Now, when it comes to those that are against Europe, not necessarily on the UKIP side, they argue that their corporations have too much power in the European Union. Do you think corporations will have more impact on our justice system if we're in the convention, or corporations have an undue impact on our parliamentary system if that's the supreme authority? Or in fact, is this all separate because it's actually the Supreme Court?
Well, I think it is. I think they're separate points. The fact is that that corporations have always been able to benefit from human rights. So, for example, many of the important media cases, like the famous case about contempt proceedings, Harold Evans' famous case about thalidomide, that was for a corporate entity. I would have thought that companies in general have more influence as pressure groups through the legislative process than through winning cases.
In a home country rather than in Brussels or Strasbourg? Though.
Yeah, I would have thought so.
I mean, some say that the mainstream press is just responding to public concern. On the other way, one could say that the mainstream media is deliberately cooking this up and saying, look, human rights law is a disaster and is helping terrorists and so on?
Well,
which way is it?
Well, I think one of the things which is seldom given the recognition it should is that the media have a vested interest in attacking the Human Rights Act. One of the things that the media were most opposed to when the Human Rights Act came into being was the fact that tittle tattle, which was subject to criticisms of breaches of the right to privacy, would win if there was no public interest in the story being published. And one of the effects of the Human Rights Act is that kiss and tell stories have been suppressed. Now, that has had a direct economic detriment to newspapers of a particular type. And it seems to me naive to put to one side any thought that the newspapers are not entirely aware of the adverse commercial consequences of the Human Rights Act, and therefore they take a position which is consistent with something that they don't find particularly congenial.
And then finally, there is this case about mass surveillance going through the Investigatory Powers Tribunal. Do you think if we got out of the Convention on Human Rights, it would make it easier or more difficult to engage in mass surveillance, for the government to engage in mass surveillance?
There's no question it would make it much easier, because the only protection we have is really through Article 8, the right of respect for private life. I mean, the fact is that privacy in the UK is not well protected under domestic law. Hence, as everyone seems to acknowledge, we are the most surveyed society of, I think, any in the world.
Richard Clayton, QC, thank you.
Thank you.
Coming up after the break...
Far too much noise, the public aren't impressed.
Speaker Burkow warns MPs that the public is not impressed with Prime Minister's questions. And Labour has lost 5 million supporters since 1997. Is it time Miliband starts putting the interests of the working classes first? All this and more in part 2 of Going Underground. Shares are soaring in pharmaceutical companies. Now G7 countries are sending in soldiers to fight Ebola in Africa. But while the future is bright for GlaxoSmithKline, it's even brighter for Imperial Designs in Africa. Ebola gives Britain an excuse to spend taxpayer money on hundreds of UK soldiers in Sierra Leone. No one seems to be asking why countries like Cuba send doctors to fight Ebola in Africa instead of soldiers. In fact, one Labour MP wanted answers from the Prime Minister about money for British people rather than British troops.
My constituents, British citizens, Mr. and Mrs. Mahmood, have been living in Sierra Leone for the last 5 years. Unsurprisingly, when Ebola spread, they spent their savings coming back to Slough. I have been trying since the beginning of this month to get them some financial support here. And I have failed, despite a promise by the Health Secretary to get a response to me, because they've been rejected on the grounds that they're not habitually resident here. I threatened to raise this in these question time, and as a result, at 11:59 today, I got a reply saying they would get no support from the DWP. What's the Prime Minister going to do about people who are fleeing Ebola to come back to the country of their nationality and have no resources?
So the government is using taxpayer money to fund UK troops to go to Sierra Leone because of Ebola, but there isn't money to help UK citizens because of Ian Duncan Smith. Cameron said he'd get back to her. Elsewhere, the Speaker may have reflected the views of ordinary people.
Far too much noise, the public aren't impressed. Let's try to operate up to a certain standard.
Standards aren't just plummeting in Parliament, though. Ed Miliband took Cameron to task about the coalition record on non-Ebola-related healthcare.
After nearly 5 years in office, he can't defend his record on the NHS in England. Every time he mentions Wales, we know he's running scared on the NHS in England. Now, in England, we have the highest waiting list for 6 years, the longest waits in A&E for 10 years, the cancer treatment target missed for the first time ever, and millions of people can't get to see their GP. Won't he just admit this? the NHS in England is going backwards, isn't it?
The PM defended the NHS.
What the former Labour advisor, who worked with him in number 10 Downing Street, who now runs NHS England, let's hear what he has to say about the NHS in England. He says this: over the past 5 years, the NHS has been remarkably successful. We're treating millions more patients than 5 years ago. The NHS has become some £20 billion more efficient. A world-leading genomes programme is harnessing the best of this country's medical expertise, and the global rankings have just ranked us the highest performing health system of 11 industrialised nations.
And Lib Dem Julian Huppert went further, explaining that Labour is the party of privatisation in the NHS.
Will the Prime Minister join me in welcoming the fact that the £800 million contract for older people's services in Cambridgeshire was awarded to the NHS bidder, in stark contrast to the £1 billion privatisation of Hinchingbrooke Hospital, tendered by the last government, who didn't even have an NHS bidder in the final 5.
Cameron agreed, out-socialisting anything on Labour's front bench.
I think my honourable friend makes an important point, which is we want to see an expansion of NHS services, and when the party opposite claims that there's some sort of secret agenda to privatise, that was the case under the last Labour government, where they fattened up contracts and insisted only on private providers. Under this government, the NHS is being properly run by those who are clinicians, and they make decisions about the future of our health service.
Comrade Cameron, the Tory leader fighting Labour privatisation in the NHS. This week, Ed Miliband pledged that Labour will crack down on immigrants coming to Britain within weeks of taking office. A Labour anti-immigrant bill will force the speaking of good English and compel companies to favour non-immigrant labour. Is this a lurch to the far right, or merely a continuation of Labour as a party that has always concealed its true ideology of supporting elites in Britain? With me is Robert Clough, author of Labour, A Party for Imperialism. Welcome, Robert, to Going Underground, its second edition, just published in the past week or so. Well, so when Labour were first started as a party, the elite said there'll never be any other government except Labour, and yet Miliband is neck and neck at the moment in the polls. Why?
Well, I think for a number of reasons, not least of all is the fact that it is not seen by the mass of its electoral base within the working class as a party standing up for their interests against the drive for austerity. For a lot of working class people, particularly in the north, they face Labour councils which are implementing savage cuts to services and jobs, which are affecting children, mothers and old people, and they're implementing the bedroom tax. They say, what's the difference?
And this is nothing new. I mean, this isn't a lurch to the right, as it were. We have all these figures from the Labour Party, obviously Ramsay MacDonald, presumably not popular at this moment, but many Labour voters and activists hark back to the days of Attlee and to Wilson. Even they don't have a good record.
No, I think that what is often forgotten is that the Labour Party, whenever it was in government between the last two wars, defended the empire completely. And although the post-Second World War government has a reputation for setting up a system of state welfare, what is ignored is the fact that it systematically plundered the colonies in West Africa and the Middle East for the finances in which to establish state welfare.
So if, I mean, in other words, millions of people were killed in effect by these leaders, why do you think then Tony Blair comes under such scrutiny for the Iraq War when this is a tradition?
I think it's because there was a tide of opposition to the war at the time the declaration was made, that he had ruthlessly, if you like, stamped on any...
But no more ruthlessly than previous leaders.
You just look at the very aggressive foreign policy which Tony Blair heralded. Is there any real difference? One can see that in relation, for instance, to the declaration of bombing in Iraq, there was no attempt to control what was the objectives of the latest bombing campaign. There was no support for the people fighting in Kobani, as they are at the moment, the Kurds, and the aggressive response in relation to Ukraine. Labour completely supports the fascist regime in Ukraine and is eager for sanctions against Russia and the extension of those sanctions. I think there is a very aggressive foreign policy there, which is related to defending Britain's vast overseas assets.
So what does it mean when people like Miliband inspire some of those who are called on the left, or spoken about as being on the left of the party, saying he's going to be a bit more like John Smith?
It's wishful thinking. I was at the TUC demonstration last Saturday, and Len McCluskey was saying that Labour is afraid of its own shadow. It must adopt some socialist policies. He's quite clear that there is very little difference currently between Labour Party policy and Condem policy, but he indulges in some wishful thinking that somehow Ed Miliband is going to bring about a socialist change. I think
well, why do the trade union elites? Because any critic of the Labour Party from the left, as it were, would say, well, at least there are trade unions involved in this party. It's not like the other parties. There are millions of workers involved in this party.
Yes, but what is the true relationship of the trade unions to the working class at the moment? And what we point out in the book is that they organise amongst a privileged, well-off layer, particularly in the public sector, and in that sense have come very little different from the old craft unions at the turn of the last century. Those unions have actually done nothing to really defend the working class against austerity, and it is a fact that over the last 10, 15 years, strike activity by trade unions in this country have reached abysmal historic lows. So, I mean, there have been hundreds of thousands of jobs lost in the public sector.
So what would you say to people watching who listen to, I don't know, Owen Jones or other people, Polly Toynbee, who's been on this show, who say Labour is the only option, and in the way that they talk about the austerity going through Britain at the moment, they seem to reflect policies that will mitigate against austerity, if not create a revolution?
Well, I think the mitigating the effects of austerity, as at this point in time, I would think only in the repeal of the bedroom tax that they promise is there any real difference. And if you look at some of the more detailed statements from someone like Rachel Reeves, you've still got commitment to the overall benefit gap, you've got commitment to the overall state welfare budget being capped. Workfare continues to be part and parcel of Labour Party policy, so there isn't that element of, you know, an alternative.
Can you see some problems, though, for them? David Cameron on Wednesday was kind of at Ed Miliband's expense, saying, we allow government bidders for NHS contracts. It was the Labour Party that said NHS contracts must be private corporations only. Is there some truth in what the Prime Minister is saying?
Oh, I think that the Condem coalition have made hay out of the privatisations that were undertaken by the last Labour government. And in relation to the promises for the future, although they say they will repeal the Health and Social Care Act, there is no commitment to end, for instance, the PFI projects, which are crippling NHS finances, and their comments or their promises about restoring £2.5 billion a year to NHS funding. Well, you just do the arithmetic. That's over 7 years of that against a £30 billion deficit that is being forecast over that 7 years. So they're not restoring the funding for the NHS.
Well, then how do you explain, if all these people are in effect war criminals, all except Ed Miliband so far arguably, how do you explain that the massive opposition to coalition austerity still want to vote Labour?
In a sense, because they have not chosen the option of fighting back. It's quite interesting. We have on the front of the book a picture of a demonstration organised by the Focus E134 Women campaign, and that, I think, is an example of what is required. There is no.
The women that are fighting social
for
cleansing, as it were.
Social cleansing in East London, yes. And that, I think, is the real option that people have to face. No government in power is going to be allowed to raise state welfare to anywhere near adequate levels, because at the end of the day, a government is allowed into power in order to protect, first and foremost, the interests of the City of London. And that means continuation and extension of austerity.
Robert Clough, thank you.
Thank you.
So it seems that the good old Bobby on the beat is a thing of the past. Instead of Dixon of Dock Green, we're now living in scenes from Serpico. But is it just a few rotten apples? Or is it the whole tree? According to a Home Office report, over 2,000 of our boys in blue are potentially corrupt. And with crimes ranging from perverting the course of justice to drug dealing, these coppers are not just dirty, they're caked in the foul stench of corruption that follows them all the way to Scotland Yard. Almost 100 police officers each year are suspended on suspicion of corruption, with Scotland Yard appearing to be the worst offender, with around 200 officers being relieved of their posts in the past 5 years. And they're not just selling stories to the Sun. Other accusations include hiding evidence, money laundering and taking bribes. But what about the ones that are in hiding? What about the hundreds and hundreds of undercover officers in our midst? According to police regulator HMIC, they apparently have a generally poor knowledge and lack of expertise. Undercover cops are being badly used and collectively or ineffectively controlled. No wonder the Ellison reported a catastrophic police actions concerning the murder of teenager Stephen Lawrence slammed the police undercover tactics. In the Lawrence case, undercover police are alleged to have spied on the family of the victim in a bid to discredit them. An investigation into whether British police aim to further destroy the lives of those who are the victims of crime is ongoing. But are they also destroying free speech? Police have caged off Parliament Square this week in an attempt to imprison the voice of democracy. Occupy have been staging a protest since last Friday, but the peaceful demonstration has been shackled by the constant imposing presence of the Met Police. David Cameron supported Hong Kong pro-democracy protests, so why are the police sabotaging ours? Show's over for today, but join us on Monday when we speak to the Executive Director of the British American Security Information Council, Paul Ingram, about why Cameron and Obama's secretive mutual defense agreement could be breaking the nuclear non-proliferation treaty. In the meantime, you can drop us a line on Twitter at @underground_RT, like our page on Facebook, or email us on goingunderground@rttv.co.uk. See you on Monday.